The Velthari Council had been speaking for 11 days straight. Not metaphorically. Not in the way politicians back on Earth used to drag hearings into overtime and call it governance. The Velthari, a species whose vocal cords had evolved into something closer to a pipe organ than a throat, could sustain continuous spoken deliberation for weeks without physical strain. Their language, Velthric, was a layered thing. It operated on 7 simultaneous tonal frequencies, and a single sentence could carry legal weight, emotional subtext, historical precedent, and a mild insult all at the same time, depending on which frequencies the listener prioritized. This was, to them, the highest form of civilization. Speaking was not just communication. Speaking was being. And so, when the Velthari Grand Deliberation, the most sacred political event in the known galaxy, held only once every 43 years, convened aboard the neutral space station known as Cradle Point, they had invited representatives from every recognized civilization to observe. 29 species, 41 delegations, over 300 individual diplomats, ambassadors, advisors, and cultural attaches all gathered in the great bowl of the deliberation chamber, a room built in the shape of an ear. The room was built in the shape of an ear on purpose. It was a Velthari philosophical statement. "We're a species that listens to itself," the architecture said. "Come and witness what true civilization sounds like." Humanity had sent one person. Her name was Mara Osei. She was 38 years old, a former acoustic engineer who had spent 12 years working in deep-sea sound mapping before transitioning to xenolinguistics. She had not been the first choice. She had not been the second choice. She had been, according to the internal memo that her supervisor had accidentally forwarded to her instead of his inbox, the only person on the xenolinguistics roster who reads Velthari secondary literature for fun and also won't say something catastrophic if left unsupervised for 5 minutes. She had read that memo twice, decided it was a compliment, and packed her bag. She had one assistant, a lanky 26-year-old named Curtis Webb who had a gift for pattern recognition and an unfortunate habit of narrating his own thought processes out loud. He had been assigned her 3 weeks ago by the Earth Diplomatic Corps, and in that time she had learned 3 things about him. He was brilliant, he was deeply anxious, and he had strong opinions about sandwiches that he would share without being asked. They arrived at Cradle Point on the morning of the 3rd day of deliberation. Mara stood at the entrance to the deliberation chamber and listened. The sound was extraordinary. The Velthari voices filled the room the way water fills a container, completely, with no gaps, no dead corners. The acoustic design of the chamber amplified and sorted the frequencies, so a listener standing at the entrance, as Mara was now, could actually hear each tonal layer separately if they focused. The legal layer, the emotional layer, the historical layer. The mild insult layer was apparently running hot today. Curtis stood beside her with a translation earpiece jammed halfway in, looking slightly dizzy. "They're arguing about the Cauldron Passage trade rights," he said. "Specifically, whether the Suolvi Federation's claim predates the Velthari territorial mapping or the other way around. The argument has been going on for," he checked his tablet, "61 hours. "I know," Mara said. "They seem fine. Like, physically fine. Their ambassador hasn't even sat down." "They don't sit," Mara said. "Sitting is a Velthari gesture that means you've conceded a point." Curtis looked at the ambassador again. "So standing for 61 hours straight is winning," Mara said. "Or, at least, not losing." She watched for a long moment. The Velthari ambassador, a tall, bone-pale figure with resonating chambers along the sides of their neck, visible even from this distance as slow rhythmic pulsing, was speaking in the middle of the chamber floor. 3 other species representatives were seated in the observation gallery above, listening with various expressions that ranged from genuine interest to polite suffering. The Suolvi representative, a broad, 6-limbed creature whose species communicated primarily through skin pattern shifts, was seated at a response podium and clearly struggling. The Suolvi had invested considerable diplomatic currency in learning spoken Velthric, but they were communicating on only 3 frequency layers instead of the required 7. Their case, technically, was being presented at about 40% of its legal weight. Nobody had told them this. Mara turned away from the chamber and walked toward the human delegation's assigned quarters, a modest set of 3 rooms that smelled faintly of the cleaning compound the station used, and which Curtis had already described as fine, but I've stayed in better airport hotels. She sat down at the small desk and opened her notes. She had been studying Velthric for 9 years. Not casually. With the particular obsessive focus that certain people apply to problems that everyone else has decided are too difficult to bother with. She had learned Velthric the same way she had once learned the acoustic geography of the ocean, by listening so long and so carefully that the thing being studied began to seem less like a foreign object and more like a familiar room. She had listened to recordings of 11 previous Grand Deliberations. She had mapped the frequency architecture of Velthric onto acoustic models she built herself, because the existing models were wrong in ways that mattered. Her 3 papers on Velthric tonal grammar, published in xenolinguistics journals with modest readership and immodest page counts, showcased her expertise. She had, at one point, built a physical resonance model out of plumbing pipe in her apartment to understand the way Velthri vocal cords produced overlapping harmonics. Her landlord had asked her to remove it. She had complied, but slowly. She understood Velthric better than any living human. She also understood something about this deliberation that the Earth Diplomatic Corps had not fully grasped when they'd sent her here. The deliberation was not going well. Not in the obvious way, not in the way of raised voices and broken alliances. In a subtler, more dangerous way. The kind of way that didn't announce itself until the damage was already permanent. She opened her notes and began to write. Curtis knocked on the open doorframe and leaned in. The Velthri Protocol office sent a formal greeting, he said, holding up a small resonance card, a physical object embedded with a short sound recording that played when held at body temperature. They want to know when our delegation will be ready to address the chamber. Mara looked up. What did you tell them? I said I'd check with you.
Good.
So, when will we be ready? Mara looked back at her notes.
I don't know yet, she said.
Maybe never. Curtis stared at her. We were sent here to speak. That's the whole point. The whole reason Earth is here. I know, she said. The Grand Deliberation only happens every 43 years. If we don't address the chamber this session, Earth doesn't get another chance until 2087, Mara said. I know. So, what are you? Curtis, she said, not unkindly. Go get us something to eat and let me think.
He went.
She could hear him in the corridor a moment later, narrating his own confusion to nobody in particular. She said maybe never, which is not a diplomatic position. That's more of an existential position. I don't think the Corps trained me for existential positions. Mara smiled faintly and kept writing. The Velthri had invented the concept of the Grand Deliberation 4,300 years ago, following a period they called the Fracture, a 2-century era of interplanetary conflict that had been caused, according to their own historians, not by resource scarcity or territorial ambition, but by talking past each other. Different Velthri regional dialects had diverged enough that the same sentence, spoken by a northerner, carried the opposite legal weight when heard by a southerner. Treaties were signed in excellent faith and broken in equal good faith, because both parties had understood different things. The Velthri solution had been radical, standardize. The Velthri solution encompassed not only language, but also the entire architecture of formal speech. The Grand Deliberation was the mechanism of that standardization, a regular renewal, a recalibration of the galaxy's diplomatic. The language was conducted in person to ensure that every frequency could be verified and no mistranslation could be obscured by distance. It was, Mara thought, a genuinely beautiful idea. It was also, she thought, in serious trouble. The problem was not the Velthri. The problem was everyone else. 29 species had been invited to observe and participate. Of those 29, only 4 communicated primarily through sound. The others used chemical signals, skin patterns, bioluminescent pulses, seismic vibration, electrical field modulation, and in one memorable case, the DOE, a gaseous organism from a high-pressure world, a form of directed atmospheric compression that other species could feel in their sinuses, but not, technically, hear. All of these species had been asked to conduct their diplomacy in Velthric. Some of them had tried. Some had succeeded, partially. Many had arrived with translation technology of varying quality. A few had brought living translators, members of their own species who had spent years learning Velthric and could relay the substance of a speech, though never its full tonal weight. The Velthri, for their part, had made accommodations. They had slowed their speech slightly, an enormous concession, since spoken speed was tied to social status in their culture, and speaking slowly was roughly equivalent to wearing an old suit to a formal dinner. They had provided written Velthric transcripts of all proceedings. They had assigned protocol liaisons to each delegation. But the gap remained. And the gap was widening. Mara had been listening to the proceedings through the chamber's audio feed since she arrived, and she had heard it, the thing no one else had named yet. The deliberation was supposed to be a conversation. What it had become was a performance. The Velthri spoke. Everyone else listened, or tried to, or pretended to. When other species responded, they did so on reduced frequencies at reduced speed, with reduced precision, and the Velthri, too polite to say so directly, adjusted their responses in kind, matching the reduced frequency, which in Velthric grammar meant they were treating the other species' statements as provisional, not final. Not binding, not real, legally speaking, which meant that everything being agreed to in this deliberation, every treaty, every territorial acknowledgement, every trade compact, was by Velthri legal linguistic standards being agreed to provisionally, not binding. It was all going to dissolve the moment anyone checked the transcripts carefully. Mara had checked them carefully. She had been checking them for 3 days before she even got on the transport to Cradle Point. She was the only person in either the human delegation or, as far as she could tell, any other delegation who had noticed. Curtis returned with food, 2 sealed containers of something that smelled aggressively nutritious, and a sealed cup of coffee he'd managed to source from somewhere on the station. He put them on the desk and sat down across from her. "Okay," he said. "I've been thinking." "I know," she said. "I could hear you."
Right.
"Sorry." He pushed one of the containers toward her. "You said maybe never. What does that mean, actually? Because I've been running through scenarios, and I can't find one where Earth not speaking is better than Earth speaking." Mara picked up the coffee. "What if speaking worsens it?" Curtis looked at her. "How does speaking worsen it?" She turned her notes around and slid them across the desk to him. He read for a while. The expression on his face went through several stages: mild confusion, sharper confusion, dawning comprehension, and then something that looked like the specific face people made when they understood a problem and immediately wished they didn't. "Oh," he said quietly. "Yeah," she said. "The whole deliberation is legally non-binding," she said, "by Velthri standards. Because nobody is speaking at full tonal weight, which means nobody is making real agreements, which means in 43 years, when they check the records, everything that got agreed to here will be gone," Curtis said. "It'll all be gone." "Provisional and expired," Mara said, which in Velthri legal terms is the same as never having happened. Curtis sat back. He was quiet for almost a full minute, which was, in Mara's experience of him, very unusual. Then he said, "So, what do we do?" Mara picked up her pen. "I'm thinking," she said. To understand why Mara's silence mattered, you have to understand what Cradle Point sounded like before she got there. It sounded like the most sophisticated noise humanity had ever been adjacent to. The station itself was old, not ancient, but old in the way of things that had been built to last and then kept being used because nobody wanted to admit they needed something newer. The Velthri constructed it 400 years ago at a gravitational midpoint between 7 star systems, in a region of space with no territorial claim, no mineral value, and no strategic position worth defending. Pure neutral ground. This is the kind of place that matters only because everyone agrees it does, which is arguably the only kind of place that is truly relevant for diplomacy. The architecture was entirely Velthri. Curved walls. No sharp angles. Every surface is slightly concave, designed to direct and reflect sound rather than absorb it. The corridors were wide enough for 4 Velthri to walk abreast, which meant they were slightly too wide for most other species, who tended to hug one wall and feel vaguely exposed. The ceilings were high and vaulted, with an organic ridged texture that broke sound into component frequencies the way a prism broke light. Walking through Cradle Point was like walking through a living instrument. Mara had loved it immediately. The other delegations were less certain. The Suolvi moved in tight groups and communicated in skin flashes so rapid they looked like they were malfunctioning. The Keth, a small, dense species from a high-gravity world who communicated in low-frequency seismic pulses, wore dampening pads on their feet and still managed to send tremors through the floor with every step. The Orvanu, an avian species, spoke in frequency ranges that the station's architecture bounced around unpredictably, so their words came back to them changed, subtly but enough to unsettle them. They had filed 3 complaints with the protocol office on the first day. And then there was the Doe. The Doe were remarkable. Not because they were powerful, though they were. Not because their civilization was ancient, though it was. Remarkable because they were the only species at Cradle Point who communicated in a way that was, technically speaking, physically felt rather than heard. The directed atmospheric compression they used for language was experienced in the body before it was processed in the mind, a low, rolling pressure wave that arrived in the chest and moved upward. When Mara had encountered a Doe for the first time, 3 years ago at a xenolinguistics conference, she had thought she was having a cardiac event. The Doe delegate at Cradle Point was named, or rather, was referred to by a translated designation that meant, approximately, pressure of the morning tide. Everyone on the station called them morning because the full designation took 11 seconds to speak even in translation, and nobody had that kind of time. Morning had been assigned a chamber on the station's outer ring, where the walls were thicker and could absorb compression waves without transmitting them to neighboring rooms. Their protocol liaison, a young Velthari named Saravath, who had the haunted look of someone who had been given a very difficult assignment and had been too polite to say no, communicated with them via a pressure-sensitive interface that translated Morning's compressions into written Velthric. The translation was, Mara knew, terrible. This is not due to any fault of the technology or Saravath. But Doe's atmospheric compression was not, at its root, linguistic. It was more like music. It carried meaning in its shape, the rate of compression, the texture of the wave, and the way it interacted with ambient pressure in the room. The written translation captured maybe 30% of the original, and usually the 30% that was easiest to translate was not always the most important. Morning, Mara suspected, knew this. Morning had been almost entirely silent since the deliberation began, participating only when directly addressed, and then only in the briefest possible exchanges. Mara had noticed. She had also noticed that Morning was, in the hours between sessions, positioned near the entrance to the deliberation chamber, just standing or hovering or whatever the right word was for what the Doe did when they occupied space, in a way that suggested they were listening. Not to the proceedings. To the room. To describe what the room sounded like when it was empty. Mara had done the same thing on her second morning at Cradle Point, at 5:30 in the morning station time, when the chamber was closed and the only sound was the station's own systems, the deep hum of life support, the faint creak of thermal expansion, and the almost inaudible resonance that the chamber's walls produced continuously, a kind of structural breathing. She had stood at the chamber entrance for 40 minutes. Then she had gone back to her room and added 4 pages to her notes. Curtis had spent the first 2 days doing what junior diplomatic staff usually did at events like this, attending every social function, collecting business cards the size of dinner plates from species whose concept of a card involved chemical information embedded in the material, and attempting to build relationships that might be useful for Earth sometime in the next 4 decades. He was skilled at it, in the way that anxious, perceptive people often were. He listened carefully. He remembered things. He asked questions that were just naive enough to seem non-threatening, but just specific enough to get real answers. On the evening of day 3, he came back to the human quarters with a recorder full of conversations and sat down across from Mara with the look of someone who had learned something surprising and wasn't sure whether it was relevant. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "You're going to anyway," she said. The Keth delegate, the one who looks like a boulder that learned to frown. "Grasover," Mara said. Their designation translates to something like deep resonance of the 8th mountain, but they prefer Grasover. "Right, Grasover. I talked to them for about an hour today through their translation interface. They're really unhappy."
"About what?"
"They said the deliberation doesn't feel real." Curtis looked at his recorder, not playing it back, just holding it. They said, and this is the translation, so I don't know how accurate it is. They said it feels like everyone is describing agreements instead of making them. Like the form is there, but the substance is missing. Mara looked at him. They said the same thing happened at the last deliberation, 43 years ago, Curtis continued. And that the agreements from that session, the ones that involved Keth territorial rights in the Orvana border region, they dissolved. Legally. 3 years after the deliberation closed, the Veltharies sent a formal notification that the agreements were provisionally expired. The Keth lost 3 systems they had occupied for 200 years. Mara was quiet. Gresover said that when they tried to appeal, the Velthari legal counsel explained that the agreements had been made at reduced tonal weight, which meant they were provisional and expired after 38 months. Curtis put the recorder down. The Keth didn't know that. They didn't know that was how it worked. They thought they'd made real agreements. They did make real agreements, Mara said. Just not in a language that treated their making as real. Curtis looked at her for a long moment. Is that what you're thinking about? Is that what all the notes are about?
Part of it, she said.
What's the other part? Mara looked down at her notes. At the maps she'd drawn, not geographic maps, but frequency maps. Diagrams of the deliberation chamber's acoustic architecture overlaid with the tonal requirements of Velthric legal speech. Calculations about what it would take to bring all 29 species diplomatic communications up to full tonal weight simultaneously. I'm thinking, she said, about what silence means in a room built to hear. Curtis waited. When she didn't continue, he said, That's either very profound or very concerning. It's both, she said. Go to sleep, Curtis.
He went.
She kept writing. Outside, in the curved corridors of Cradle Point, the station breathed its quiet mechanical breath, and the deliberation continued, and 28 species made agreements that would, by the time anyone checked, mean nothing whatsoever. And in a wide corridor near the deliberation chamber entrance, morning, third pressure of the morning tide, stood in the dark and felt the shape of the room's silence with something that might, in another species, have been called grief. Mara slept 4 hours and woke at 3 in the morning station time with a solution in her head that scared her. This happened to her sometimes. The problem would sit in the back of her mind all day, invisible, and then somewhere in the deep hours it would surface, fully formed, like something that had been growing in the dark and finally reached the light. She had learned not to be frightened by the process itself, learned to trust it. But the solutions that arrived this way were often the kind that changed things in ways that couldn't be unchanged. This one was so kind. She sat up and turned on the desk light and opened her notes to a blank page and wrote down the solution in full before she could second-guess it. Then she read it back. Then she sat very still for a while. The solution was not technical, not in the way of repairing something broken. It was architectural, a restructuring of how the deliberation communicated, not just what it communicated. And it required something that no human had ever attempted in an official diplomatic setting with this many species present. It required Mara to not speak. Not as a political position. Not as a refusal. As a statement. One that in Velthric tonal grammar carried more weight than almost anything she could say. In Velthric, silence in a formal deliberation context was not neutral. It was not the absence of communication. It was one of the most precise and powerful communicative acts in the language, but only when deployed correctly, with the right frequency signature, at the right moment in the deliberation's legal architecture. Silence in Velthric was a claim. Specifically, it was a claim of a witness. The speaker declared that they had observed something and were choosing not to resolve it with words, as words were insufficient in this instance. The silence said, I have seen what cannot yet be spoken. I am holding it until the room is ready. It was the linguistic equivalent of raising your hand at the highest possible volume. The Velthari had not used it in open deliberation for over 200 years, because the last time it had been used, it had caused a legal crisis that took a decade to untangle. Not because it went wrong, because it went right. Because it worked so precisely that everyone in the chamber had heard it for what it was, and the implications had been so enormous that the entire deliberation had halted for 9 days while the legal counsel decided how to respond. Mara had read everything ever written about that incident. She had read it the way other people read thriller novels, not for the plot, but for the architecture underneath, for the grammar of what had happened. And she knew, with the calm certainty of someone who has checked their calculations 3 times and found them consistent, that if she entered the deliberation chamber and deployed that silence correctly at the right moment, with the right frequency signature, the Velthary would have to stop. The whole deliberation would have to stop. And in that stopping, in that enforced pause, there would be a window, narrow and urgent, and possibly the only one they were going to get, to address what was actually happening. The problem was the frequency signature. Deliberative silence in Velthric was more than just refraining from talking. It was a performance absence. It required the speaker to enter the chamber resonance, the ambient frequency produced by the chamber's walls, and align their body to it in a way that created a perceptible harmonic gap. A shaped silence. The room heard what wasn't there, and what wasn't there had a specific acoustic form. Velthary could do this instinctively. Their resonating chambers, the visible pulsing structures along their necks, could modulate their body's ambient acoustic signature to match, and then diverge from the room's resonance on command. Humans could not do this the way the Velthary could.
But
Mara had spent 12 years mapping acoustic environments. She had spent 6 of those years doing it in deep ocean conditions, where the manipulation of resonance frequency was the difference between accurate data and garbage. She had learned in those years to feel resonance frequencies not just with instruments but with her body. To use her own physical presence acts like an antenna, detecting and adjusting to the acoustic environment in the same way a musician adjusts to a new performance space. She had never done it as a linguistic act. She had never needed to. She thought she could. She was not certain. The not certain part was where the fear came in. Because if she got it wrong, it would not be simply a failed diplomatic gesture. In Velthric deliberative grammar, an incorrectly performed silence was not neutral either. It was an accusation, specifically an accusation of deliberate obfuscation. She was accused of concealing something from the chamber. If she got it wrong, humanity's diplomatic position at cradle point would not merely fail. It would end. This would not be limited to this particular session. The Velthary Legal Council would have grounds to formally exclude Earth from future deliberations on the basis of bad faith communication. 43 years. 86 years. Maybe permanently. Mara sat with that for a while. Then she picked up her pen and wrote at the bottom of the page, "The risk of being misunderstood is not a reason to stay silent. It is precisely the reason to be precise." She paused. Then she crossed out the reason to be precise and wrote the reason to be ready. She started preparing. The frequency map took her 7 hours to complete. It was a diagram of the deliberation chamber's acoustic architecture, a detailed rendering of every surface, every angle, and every resonance node, mapped against the ambient frequency produced by the chamber's walls at various times of day as the station's temperature shifted and the materials expanded and contracted. She built it from 3 sources: the station's own architectural records, which she requested through the protocol office on day 1 and received with minimal comment, the audio recordings she'd made the chamber in the early morning, and her own acoustic models of Velthric deliberative space, built over years and refined against every recorded Grand Deliberation she'd been able to access. The map told her 2 things. First, the optimal moment for the silence. It needed to happen when the chamber resonance was in its lowest phase, the early morning window, when thermal contraction made the walls resonate at their deepest frequency. The event happened between 5:15 and 5:45 station time, and the chamber opened for the day's session at 6. If Mara was in position at the right moment, the room itself would amplify what she did. Second, she couldn't do it alone. Not because she lacked the technical ability. However, in Velthric grammar, deliberative silence required a minimum of 2 witnesses present in the chamber for it to have legal standing. A single person standing silent in an empty room was just a person standing silent in an empty room. She needed a witness. Not just any witness. A witness who would be understood by the Velthary Legal Council as a legitimate observer, meaning a representative of a recognized species who had standing in the deliberation. Mara thought about who she'd seen listening in that corridor. She put down her pen, stood up, stretched her back, and went to find morning. The doe did not sleep. Or rather, They entered a state that served a similar restorative function but which looked, from the outside, like a slightly denser version of their waking state, a more compact atmospheric presence, a slower rhythm to the compression waves they continuously emitted.
Mara had read about this.
She had also read that approaching a doe in this state without the proper greeting protocol was considered, in doe culture, approximately equivalent to slapping someone awake. Not hostile, exactly, but jarring. And the doe registered jarring experiences physically, a sudden shift in atmospheric pressure in their immediate environment, so the practical consequence was that they might accidentally compress you hard enough to bruise. She stood outside Morning's chamber door and thought about how to knock. She thought about it for a moment. Then she took a slow breath and pressed her palm flat against the door, not knocking, just adding pressure. A gentle, sustained, deliberate pressure. Not a knock. More like a lean. The door was metal and slightly cool under her hand. She felt nothing happen for almost a minute. Then she felt the response, a very faint pressure wave that came through the door itself, through the wall, and through the floor under her feet. Not sound. Not vibration, exactly. More like a change in the air, the way you felt weather coming before you could hear it. Morning was awake. Morning, I had noticed. A moment later, the door opened. It was difficult to describe what Morning looked like, because the doe were not a visually oriented species, and their appearance had not evolved to carry social information the way the appearances of visually dominant species had. What Mara saw was a roughly cylindrical atmospheric density, a vertical column of air that was perceptibly more there than the surrounding air.
There was no clear boundary.
Morning simply became denser toward the center and less dense toward the edges, so the effect was something like standing near a very calm whirlpool. Within the density there was structure. Something that resolved, if you looked at it for a while, into a kind of internal organization, regions of different pressure gradients that suggested anatomy, though nothing you could point to and name. The eyes, if that was the right word, were areas of particularly organized pressure. Mara had once read a paper that described them as pressure foci, points where the doe's ambient field was most coherent and most directed. They didn't look like eyes. But when Morning turned them toward her, she felt seen. She said, "I'm Mara Osei. Human delegation." She paused, then added, in the pressure language approximation, that she had been studying for 3 years and was, she estimated, roughly at the level of a 3-year-old doe child, a slow, deliberate exhalation that released a gentle compression wave in the direction of Morning's foci. It was meant to say, "I come with a question I cannot fully speak." The translation was imperfect. It probably came out as something more like, "I have an incomplete thing near me." But Morning responded. The response was a compression wave that arrived in Mara's chest before she processed it, a structured thing, layered, with a slow opening movement and a sharper inner core. Her translation interface, after a lag, rendered it as, "The human who listens during empty hours." "I have noticed you. You've been listening to the chamber," Mara said. Another wave. The interface provided her with the message, "The room speaks when it is not in use. What it says is truer than what is said when it is in use." Mara felt the rightness of that settle in her chest like the solution had settled in her head at 3 in the morning. "I need to explain something," she said, "and then I need to ask you for something, and I need you to know that what I'm asking is not without risk." She spoke for 20 minutes, slowly and clearly, with the translation interface running. She explained what she had found in the transcripts. She explained what Velthary's deliberative silence meant, how it worked, and why she could do it. She explained what she needed from Morning. Morning was silent throughout, truly silent, in the way that made the air feel very still. When Mara finished, there was a long pause. Then Morning produced a wave that the interface translated as, "You are asking me to witness an act that could fail." "Yes," Mara said. "If it fails, the consequence falls on you. On humanity's diplomatic position, yes. But the consequence of not acting falls on everyone," Mara said. "All 29 species. Every agreement being made here dissolves in 38 months." Another long pause. The quality of the silence felt different from a human silence. More textured, more present. "The Keth lost 3 systems," Morning said. The interface rendered it flatly, but the compression wave that carried the words had a quality, a density in the opening movement that Mara read as old pain. "Your people lost something too," she said. Not a question. The wave that answered was the most complex thing the interface had attempted to translate so far. It gave her a string of words that didn't fully connect. Territory, duration, agreement, the shape of an absence, what remains when the sound has been retracted. Mara thought she understood. "The last deliberation," she said. "The Doe made agreements too." "We made agreements in the only language we have," Morning said. "We were told the translation was sufficient." 38 months later, we received a written notification from Velthric that our agreements were provisional and had expired.
"I'm sorry," Mara said.
"The thing you were planning, if it works, what happens?" "The deliberation pauses," Mara said. "The Velthri Legal Council has to respond to the silence claim. And I'll tell them what I've found. What's been happening. All of it. The situation is unfolding at a full Velthric tonal frequency." She paused. "And I'll argue for a new protocol. A way for all species to make real agreements in this chamber, not provisional ones. Something that allows people to communicate without requiring them to speak a language they weren't built to speak. This procedure has not been done before." "I know. Velthri values precedent very highly." "I know that too." The atmosphere in the corridor shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly. A sort of settling. A reorientation. "What do you need from me?" Morning said. Mara said, "I need you to be in the chamber at 5:15 tomorrow morning. And I need you to do something very specific when I finish." She told Morning what it was. Morning was quiet again for almost 2 minutes. Mara began to wonder if she had asked too much, if the translation had failed, or if something about the request had landed wrong, as the silence stretched on for almost 2 minutes. Then Morning said, "That is the truest thing I have been asked to do since I arrived here." "Is that a yes?" Mara asked.
"It is a yes," Morning said.
"It is also an observation." Mara walked back to the human quarters in the dark of the station's night cycle, her footsteps soft on the concave floors, the corridor's acoustic architecture turning her own quiet movement into something that sounded, faintly, like the breath of a sleeping giant. Curtis was awake. He was sitting at the desk with a cup of tea and a tablet, and when Mara came in, he looked up with the expression of someone who had decided to be calm about something concerning. "You were gone for 2 hours," he said. "I was talking to Morning." He absorbed this. "The Doe delegate." "Yes." "You speak Doe?" "A little." The interface helped. Curtis looked at her for a moment.
"Mara,
"What are you planning?" She sat down and told him. He was quiet all the way through, which was unusual enough that she kept checking his face to see if he was still processing or had simply stopped functioning. When she finished, he said, "And you're sure about the frequency signature?" "Sure enough." "What does that mean on a scale of?" "It means I've checked it as many times as I can check it with the information I have," she said. "And I believe it's right." Curtis looked at his tea. "And if you're wrong?" "Then I've ended humanity's diplomatic standing at Cradle Point for the foreseeable future and possibly permanently." "Right," he said.
"Right. Okay."
And he stopped. Started again. "And if you're right?" Mara was quiet for a moment. "If I'm right," she said, "then maybe the next 29 species that sit in that chamber can actually talk to each other." Curtis sat with that for a while. Then he said, "I'm going with you." "You don't have to."
"I know," he said.
"I'm going." Mara looked at him. He looked back, not anxious now, not narrating his own confusion. Just present. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Let me know how it goes first." At 4:45 a.m. station time, Mara, Curtis, and Morning moved through the empty corridors of Cradle Point toward the deliberation chamber. The station in its night cycle was a different space entirely. The lighting dropped to a warm amber that the designers had likely intended as restful and which instead, in the curved concave corridors with their resonance architecture walls, produced the effect of moving through the inside of a lit lantern. Every footstep, Mara's, Curtis's, came back to them softly, altered slightly by each surface it touched. Morning produced no footsteps. Morning produced a barely perceptible pressure difference that moved with them, as if a pocket of quieter air had decided to accompany them. The deliberation chamber's main doors were sealed for the night cycle. But the protocol record showed a maintenance access point on the northeast curve, not secret, just rarely used. Mara had filed a maintenance access request with the station administration 2 days ago, citing acoustic survey purposes, which was not false. The access had been granted without comment. The door opened with a soft, resonant click, the station's materials at their coolest, tightest contraction. They stepped inside. The deliberation chamber in the dark and in the silence was one of the most remarkable things Mara had ever experienced. She had been in the space of acoustic instruments before, concert halls, recording spaces, and a cathedral in Lisbon that had made her stand absolutely still for 20 minutes because the silence there was alive in a way that felt like presence. This was different from all of those. The deliberation chamber had been built by a species that understood sound the way architects understood space, as something to be shaped, directed, given weight, and given meaning. Every surface was intentional. Every curve was a choice. In the silence, with no deliberation happening, no voices layering and overlapping and arguing across 7 tonal frequencies. In this silence, the room was doing what rooms built this way always eventually did. It was resonating with itself. The walls, cooled and contracted in the night cycle, were producing their own ambient frequency, a deep, complex chord that sat right at the edge of human hearing. Mara could feel it more than hear it. A vibration that began in the soles of her feet and moved upward settled in her chest as a kind of fullness, which made the air feel thick with something that was not quite sound. This was the frequency she needed to align to. She stopped in the center of the chamber floor, the exact center where the acoustic architecture converged, where the room's self-resonance was strongest, and stood still. Curtis stopped several steps behind her. He had the expression of someone who had just realized he was in the presence of something larger than what he'd been told to expect. Morning took a position near the chamber's eastern wall, not close to Mara, not close to Curtis, but in the arc of the room where atmospheric compression would interact with the chamber's resonance structure most cleanly. They had discussed this. Morning had understood and had suggested a position that Mara had verified against her frequency map. Mara closed her eyes. She took one slow breath in, let it go completely, took another. The room's resonance was there, a low F-sharp, approximately if you mapped it onto the Western tonal system, though that mapping was imperfect and maybe slightly dishonest. More accurately, it was a feeling that had the qualities of a low F-sharp, a weight, a depth, and a vibration that suggested something vast and stable beneath you. She began. What she did was difficult to describe in terms that would make sense to someone who hadn't done it, like describing a balance to someone who hadn't stood on one foot. It was a physical discipline, learned over years, the way a musician learned breath control. She slowed her breathing to match the room's rhythm. She made small adjustments to her posture, not dramatic, not performative, but precisely calibrated, the way you'd tune a string. She was changing the way her body interacted with the ambient acoustic field, shifting her own very modest human bioacoustic signature, the slight sound of breathing, of heartbeat, of the fluid systems of a living body, into alignment with the room's resonance, and then, slowly, beginning to create a gap. Not an absence of herself. A shaped absence. A silence that had a specific acoustic form, the way a shadow had a specific shape. She was writing in silence. The room heard it. She felt it. The moment the room's resonance shifted around what she was doing, the way a river shifts around a stone it has just acknowledged. Not dramatic. Subtle. A change in the quality of the fullness in her chest. Curtis, behind her, later described what he saw as nothing really, but then it was a very specific kind of nothing, the kind that made you feel like you'd just walked into a room where something important had been said. Morning, at the eastern wall, I felt it as a change in the atmospheric pressure signature of the space, the room's ambient field reorganizing around a focused absence, the way wind reorganized around a form. Morning waited for the moment Mara had described. Mara held the silence for 37 seconds. This was not random. It was the shortest time allowed by law for a pause in conversation according to Velthric tonal grammar, a limit she had figured out from past legal cases with great care because she knew how important it was. At 37 seconds, Morning acted. What Morning did was simple in its form and profound in its effect. They released a single compression wave, not language, not communication in any conventional sense, but a pure tonal response, an acknowledgement, in atmospheric grammar, of having witnessed an act of significance. The compression wave interacted with the chamber's resonance architecture in a way that neither Mara nor Morning had fully predicted, but that both of them, afterward, would recognize as right. The shaped silence Mara had fit into was, acoustically speaking, a void, and the DO compression wave fit into it the way a key fits into a lock. The chamber's resonance, suddenly presented with both a shaped human absence and a DO presence wave that complemented it, produced something new. A compound frequency. A sound that had both elements in it, Mara's silence and Morning's witness, woven together by the room's architecture into something the chamber walls recognized and amplified. It sounded, according to Curtis, who was the only one present who wasn't doing anything technical and could therefore just listen, like a chord resolving in a register you felt rather than heard. Like the moment in a piece of music where the tension finally, fully, releases. The deliberation chamber's monitoring systems, which ran continuously even during the night cycle, registered the compound frequency at 5:22 a.m. station time. In the protocol office at the other end of the station, an alert woke the night cycle duty liaison. A young Velthari, who had never seen this particular alert before, had been told it existed but had always expected it to remain theoretical, and who now stared at their screen for a full 2 minutes before picking up the communication line to the senior protocol authority. The message they sent was brief. It said, "A deliberative silence claim has been filed. Origin: human delegation. Witness: DO delegation. Filed at 5:22. The claim is formally valid." The senior protocol authority, who had been asleep, was awake within 30 seconds. The Grand Deliberation, which had been running for 14 days, was, as of 5:23 a.m. station time, legally halted. The halt of a Grand Deliberation had happened twice in recorded Velthari history. The first time had been the crisis Mara had read about, 800 years ago, during a deliberation that was already fracturing, when a senior council speaker had filed a silence claim in response to what they had witnessed as a fundamental breakdown in the deliberation's tonal integrity. The claim had halted the proceedings for 9 days and ultimately resulted in a complete restructuring of how formal deliberations were conducted, the creation of the frequency verification protocols that now supposedly ensured every speaker was speaking at a legal tonal weight. Those protocols, Mara had established, were broken in practice. Not intentionally, not through malice. Through the simple fact that they had been designed for an era when only Velthari participated in the deliberation and had never been meaningfully updated for the reality of 29 species. The second halt had been 400 years ago. The details were sealed under a Velthari legal restriction that Mara had not been able to access. She had noted its existence and moved on. This instance was the third. The senior protocol authority, whose name was Vethra and who held the highest formal linguistic rank in the Velthari Council, arrived at the deliberation chamber at 6:12 a.m., 49 minutes after the alert. 3 members of the legal council and a documentation specialist accompanied them. Mara, Curtis, and Morning were waiting. The encounter that followed was later described by Curtis as the most expensive silence I've ever been present for, and by Morning's translated communications as the moment when the room finally heard itself. Vethra entered the chamber and stopped. They were a tall Velthari, older than most Mara had seen at cradle point, age in Velthari visible not in the way of human aging, but in the complexity of the resonating chambers along the neck, which accumulated additional resonance structures over time and gave older Velthari voices a richness and depth that was, honestly, extraordinary. Vethra's voice, when they eventually spoke, sounded like a cathedral considering an opinion. For now, though, they were silent. They stood in the chamber, and they listened to what the room still carried. The ambient resonance that had been altered by what Mara and Morning had done, still present in the chamber's materials hours later, the way a scent persisted in a fabric. Vethra turned to Mara. In Velthric, full Velthric, all 7 frequencies, legal weight undiminished, they said, "You filed a silence claim." Mara replied in Velthric, "With 7 frequencies. Not Velthari perfect. Her resonating anatomy was fundamentally different, and certain tonal nuances were beyond what human vocal cords could produce. But the legal weight was there. The structural precision was there. She said, "I have witnessed something that cannot be resolved with words until the room is ready to hear it." Vethra's resonating chambers pulsed. The legal council members behind them exchanged rapid low-frequency exchanges that Mara caught the shape of, but not all of the content. Vethra said, "The silence claim requires the witness to present what they have witnessed." "The room is listening," Mara said. "The room has been listening for 14 days. The room has listened to agreements made in a provisional tone. I have witnessed 29 species making commitments that, by Velthari legal linguistic standards, will expire in 38 months. I am requesting that this deliberation acknowledge what has happened and determine how to address it." The silence that followed was not like Mara's silence. It was not shaped. In the silence of a room, something unexpected had been clearly said, and everyone needed a moment to understand what they had heard. Vethra said quietly, in a frequency register Mara recognized as the one used for statements that required careful consideration before being spoken, "You're saying that the deliberations agreements are non-binding." "I am saying," Mara replied, "that the agreements have been made in good faith by every species present, and that the mechanisms by which this deliberation records and formalizes those agreements do not reflect that good faith." "I am not making an accusation. I am presenting an observation." Another silence. Shorter. Vethra said, "Show me." The next 4 hours were the most technically demanding of Mara's professional life. She had brought everything, all the transcripts, all the frequency analyses, the maps, and the calculations. She laid them out in the chamber, using the display interfaces the station provided, and she walked Vethra and the legal counsel through each one. Every species, every exchange, every instance of reduced tonal weight, every place where an agreement had been made was classified as provisional in a frequency register by Velthric legal grammar. She did this in Velthric. All 7 frequencies. For 4 hours. Her voice was hoarse by the end of it. Her throat hurt in a way that she suspected would last for several days. But she did not drop a frequency. She did not reduce tonal weight on a single statement. The legal counsel checked her against the transcripts in real time. They found 2 places where her analysis was in error. She acknowledged both and corrected them. This, she later learned, was significant. The acknowledgement of error without evasion was, in Velthric deliberative grammar, a marker of high-integrity testimony. When she finished, Vethra was quiet for a long time. Then they said, "How many deliberations has this been occurring?" Mara said, "I have evidence for the last 4. I believe it may have been occurring since the first non-Velthari species was invited to participate." Another long silence. "Why?" Vethra said, and the frequency register was not accusatory. It was genuinely asking, in the register Velthari used for questions of deep significance. "Has no one said this before?" Mara thought about the Keth losing 3 systems. About mourning. Standing in the corridor listening to an empty room. About 29 species made agreements they believed were real. She said, because to say it in this room, in a way that this room could hear, required speaking a language most species here were not built to speak. And those who were built to speak it had reason not to. The legal counsel stirred. One of them, younger, with fewer resonant structures, their voice carrying a sharper tonal register, said something rapid in low frequency. Velthric that Mara caught as, "She is implying." "She is not implying," Vethra said, with a calm of absolute authority. "She is presenting an observation. The implication that follows from the observation is ours to examine." The younger council member was quiet. Vethra turned back to Mara. "What are you requesting?" they said. Mara said, "I'm not requesting anything yet. I have finished presenting my observation. The silence claim has been fulfilled." She paused. "What happens next is not a human decision." Vethra looked at her, really looked at her, with the particular attention that Mara had learned to recognize in Velthari as the equivalent of someone leaning forward. "Why did you choose silence?" they said. "You could have requested an audience. You could have filed a formal objection through the protocol office." Mara said, A formal objection would have been heard at protocol tier weight, which is lower than deliberative weight. An audience request would have been granted in a format that allowed a formal response, which could have been used to table the matter until after the deliberation closed. She paused. The silence claim was the only mechanism that required the deliberation to stop and listen immediately. I used the most precise tool available. Vethra was quiet for a moment. Then, in a frequency register that Mara recognized, her heart beating slightly faster as she recognized it, as formal respect, the highest register, the one used for acknowledging an act of genuine linguistic integrity. You speak our language, Vethra said, better than most of our own people bother to. Mara said, your language is worth the effort. That was suspended for 3 days. This was the Velthari Legal Council's decision, and it was a serious one. 3 days in the middle of a grand deliberation was not a pause, it was a restructuring. Everything that had been agreed upon in the previous 14 days was formally flagged as pending review. 29 delegations were notified. Confusion, surprise, and in some cases significant alarm radiated out from the protocol office for the first 12 hours. Mara slept for 10 of those hours. When she woke, Curtis had already organized a briefing with 7 of the other delegations, the ones he had identified, through his 2 days of social circuit work, as most likely to engage constructively rather than reactively. He had done this without being asked, using his initiative and his own considerable talent for finding the right frequency in a room full of different kinds of people. He presented Mara with the schedule over coffee that he had again somehow sourced from somewhere on the station and said, I know you're tired. These are the ones worth talking to first. Mara looked at the schedule. He had the Keth, the Suolvi, 3 smaller species whose names she recognized from the transcripts, and she looked again, Morning. Morning already knows, she said. Morning, I asked to be included, Curtis said. I think they want to say something. The briefing happened in the human delegation quarters, which were too small for the purpose but which had the advantage of being the most acoustically neutral space Mara had access to, not built for Velthari resonance. Not optimized for any particular species, just flat walls and a low ceiling, and a table that was slightly too short for the Keth, but workable. Grassover, the Keth delegate, arrived first. They settled into a position near the wall that Mara recognized as the seismic equivalent of sitting at the head of a table. They produced a low pulse that her translation earpiece rendered as a greeting form used between parties who have identified a shared concern. The Suolvi delegate, who had introduced herself as Vess, arrived with her secondary liaison and settled into a chair with the focused energy of someone who had been waiting for this conversation for longer than they would admit. Morning arrived last and took the space near the door, the position that, in Doe's spatial grammar, indicated a willingness to leave quickly if asked, and also, Mara had learned, indicated that you were taking the conversation seriously enough to position yourself where you could not be easily distracted. Curtis took notes. He was excellent at notes. Mara did not lead the briefing the way a diplomat would have led it. She did not manage it or moderate it. She opened it, explained briefly and clearly what she had found, what she had done, and what was now happening, and then she stepped back. What happened next surprised her slightly, though in retrospect it shouldn't have. The other species talked. Not at each other, not past each other. They talked about what had happened, the previous deliberations, the expired agreements, the losses. The Keth's 3 systems. The Suolvi trade routes that had been provisionally agreed to and then, 39 months later, disputed, because 38 months had been the Velthari standard and nobody had thought to count. The smaller species. Agreements about research access, about navigational rights, and about cultural exchange programs were all provisional and expired, and all quietly retroacted. Morning said, through their interface, that the Doe had lost something more abstract but no less real, recognition. Formal Velthari acknowledgement of Doe as a civilization with legal standing in the deliberation framework. The agreement had been made. It had expired. The Doe had spent 23 years in a state of legal non-existence before anyone had clarified the situation. The room was quiet after that. Grassover produced a pulse that the interface rendered as, this is not an accident. Vess said, it might be. The Velthari value precision. If they had intended the gaps, they would have been more precise about hiding them. Morning said, intention is less important than effect. Mara said, both of you are right, and the distinction matters for what comes next. She waited for the interfaces to relay this. If it's intentional, the response is confrontational. If it's structural, a design that worked for one species and was never updated, the response is collaborative. Grassover said, "You believe it is structural." Mara said, "I believe the Velthari built a framework that was internally consistent and genuinely well-intentioned, and then invited the galaxy into it without asking whether the framework fit the galaxy."
She paused.
"I think they may not have known it didn't fit. I think no one had ever told them in a language they could hear." Vess's skin pattern shifted through several quick changes that her liaison translated as, "And now you have told them." "Now I have told them," Mara said. "What they do with it is still open." The legal council met for 31 hours. Mara was not in the room for any of it. No other species representatives were. The Velthari deliberated alone, in full frequency, at full speed, in the closed space of their internal council chamber. What came out of those 31 hours, what Vethra presented to the assembled delegations on the morning of the third day, was not what Mara had expected. She had expected acknowledgement, a concession, and perhaps an offer to review the provisional agreements. Possibly a formal apology, carefully worded, that admitted structural failure, without personal culpability. What she got was something that made Curtis, standing beside her, whisper, "Oh."
"Oh, wow."
Vethra stood in the center of the chamber and spoke in full 7-frequency Velthric and then paused after each statement for the translation infrastructure to relay the full legal weight to every delegation present. They said, "The legal council has reviewed the claim presented by the human delegation. We have found the claim to be accurate. The deliberation has been operating with systematic tonal weight reduction for a period we now estimate to encompass at least 6 prior sessions, potentially more." A pause for translation. "We find that this systematic reduction has resulted in approximately 847 distinct agreements being made in provisional status without the knowledge of the parties making them. Of these, we estimate 312 have already expired." Another pause. "The legal council has determined that this constitutes a failure of the deliberation framework, resulting from an unfounded assumption of equivalence rather than malice. We assumed that an invitation to participate was the same as a provision of the tools to do so. We were wrong." Curtis whispered. "Did a Velthari senior official just say they were wrong?" Mara whispered back, 7 frequencies. "The legal council is proposing the following, that this deliberation be extended by a period not to exceed 100 days. During this period, all provisional agreements should be reviewed in consultation with the affected parties. That a new framework, one designed in consultation with representatives of every species present, be developed for how agreements are made and recorded in future deliberations, and that this new framework be ratified before the deliberation closes." Vethra paused. Then, in the frequency register that Mara recognized as formal respect, but expanded now, broadcast at a volume she had never heard from a Velthari speaker, a frequency that made the room's walls ring with it. "The Velthari Council acknowledges the human delegation's act of deliberative witness. We acknowledge that the act required precise knowledge of our language, significant personal risk, and a commitment to the function of this deliberation that exceeded any obligation the human delegation had undertaken." They stopped. The room was very still. "We ask," Vethra said, "if the human delegation would be willing to assist in the design of the new framework." The chamber was silent. Mara stepped forward. She said, in Velthric at full 7-frequency legal weight, in the formal register of acceptance, "Yes." The next 40 days were the most exhausting and most extraordinary of Mara's life. The framework work began the morning after Vethra's announcement and did not stop, not really, not in the way of a project with breaks and weekends. It ran continuously, rotating through working sessions that involved different combinations of species, translation infrastructure, legal experts, acoustic engineers. Mara drafted 2 of the station's own technical staff after 2 days because the acoustic requirements were beyond what she could address alone, and, increasingly, Morning's role was not initially clear to anyone except Mara. She had asked Morning to be part of the framework team in the same conversation where she'd asked for their witness, and the reason was specific: the DOE experienced language as physics. Atmospheric compression was, at its foundation, not a metaphor for communication. It was communication made literal, made physical, made into something you could measure and feel and quantify. What Mara needed was someone who understood the materiality of language at a level that most species never had to think about. What she needed, in other words, was someone who understood that the medium was not neutral. Morning understood this the way you understood something you had lived with your whole life. They began contributing to the framework work in the second week, initially through written interface. Then, as the translation infrastructure was iteratively improved and recalibrated by Curtis and two Valtteri technical staff who had developed, in about 48 hours, a functional obsession with the problem through direct atmospheric interface, which the team eventually learned to read as naturally as they read each other's speech. Curtis, characteristically, was the first to develop a real working conversational rapport with Morning that didn't require the interface. He did it by developing a personal notation system, a series of hand gestures he derived from the compression wave shapes in the translation database, rough and approximate but directionally correct, and using them in meetings to back-channel to Morning what he was observing about the rest of the room. Morning responded with micro-compressions, subtle enough not to interrupt the meeting, that Curtis learned to read as confirmation, disagreement, or the DOE equivalent of a raised eyebrow. Mara watched this happen over the course of a week and felt something that she identified, after a moment's consideration, as hope. The framework itself was built around a single central idea that Mara had not thought of. It had come from Grassover, in the third working session, through a translation that had been rough but clear enough. Grassover had said, "The problem with the current framework is that it uses one language to record agreements made in 41 languages. The translation is treated as equivalent to the original. It is not. A record of a conversation is not the same as the conversation itself." Everyone in the room had been quiet for a moment. Then Mara had said, "So the record needs to be in all the languages simultaneously." Grassover, or in none of them. In something that belongs to none of us, and therefore does not privilege any of us. This was the insight that the framework was built on. The new recording system, the thing that would be designed, prototyped, tested, and ultimately ratified before the deliberation closed, was not a translation system. It was a resonance system. Each agreement would be recorded not in any single language, but in a composite acoustic atmospheric seismic signature built from all the communicative inputs of all the parties making the agreement. Not translated into Velthric. Not translated into anything. Recorded as itself, a physical artifact of the agreement's making, in the full complexity of every language that had participated in making it. The legal weight of an agreement would not be determined by Velthric tonal frequency. It would be determined by the completeness and coherence of the composite signature, whether all parties had been fully present, fully participating, and fully registered in the record. Vethera, when Mara presented the concept at the end of week 2, was silent for a long time. Then they said it would require the Veltheri legal framework to accept non-Velthric evidence as legally binding. "Yes," Mara said. "This has not been done. I know. The legal counsel will require time to consider whether this is within the scope of the deliberations authority." "I know," Mara said. "That's why I'm presenting it now rather than at the end." Vethera looked at her. "You are thinking about the timeline." "I'm always thinking about the timeline," Mara said. "There's always a timeline." The legal counsel took 11 days to consider it. In those 11 days, Mara did not stop working on the framework. She kept building it out, the technical specifications, the prototype design, the legal language, and the protocols for how the composite signature system would work in practice. She worked with the Suolvi acoustic engineers, who turned out to have relevant expertise in multimodal recording systems. She worked with two Keth technical delegates who understood seismic recording in ways that were directly applicable. She worked with Morning on the atmospheric compression component, which was the most technically demanding and also, Mara thought, the most elegant. Curtis coordinated everything. He ran schedules, tracked outstanding questions, maintained communication with all 29 delegations, drafted summaries in plain language versions of 6 different diplomatic registers, and kept everyone fed and rested with the organized efficiency of someone who had found, in the chaos, the thing they were genuinely good at. On the 9th day of the council's deliberation, he brought Mara coffee and said, "Can I ask you something?" Yes, she said, not looking up from the atmospheric signature specifications she was reviewing. Why did you actually not want to speak?
He paused.
Not the technical reason. The real reason. Mara looked up. Because, she said slowly, I've spent 9 years learning a language that most people decided wasn't worth the effort, and in that time I've watched what happens when people try to communicate across a gap they've decided is impassable. They either stop trying or they try and get it wrong, or they spend all their energy arguing about whose responsibility the gap is, and meanwhile the gap gets wider.
She paused.
I didn't want to be one more voice in a room full of voices that weren't really hearing each other. I wanted to do something that would make the room stop and listen to what was actually there. Curtis considered this. And the silence was the thing that made the room listen. The silence was the thing the room was built to respond to, Mara said. I didn't invent it. I just learned it well enough to use it. Curtis nodded. Then he said, You know what I think? Tell me. I think you learned it because you understood from the start that the gap wasn't language. The gap was whether anyone cared enough to cross it. Mara was quiet for a moment. That's either very profound, she said, or very obvious. It's both, Curtis said, and handed her the coffee. On the 11th day, Vethra called a plenary session and announced the legal counsel's decision. The composite signature system was accepted in principle. The legal framework would be amended to recognize composite resonance signatures as binding evidence of agreement. The technical specifications would need to be finalized and ratified before the close of the deliberation. And this was the part that made the room go hushed. The Velthri Legal Counsel was formally proposing that the framework be applied retroactively to the 312 expired agreements. Not reinstated automatically. Reviewed, reopened, and renegotiated using the new system, with a full understanding that the original parties had entered those agreements in good faith and deserved the opportunity to make them binding. This would take more than the remaining time in the current deliberation. Vethra acknowledged this. The Velthri Council, they said, is proposing that a standing review commission be established.
Permanent.
It convenes only every 43 years. Operating continuously, with representation from every signatory species, with the authority to process retroactive agreements and to monitor the function of the new framework in real time.
They paused.
This is a significant change, they said. We are aware of that. We propose this change because it is clear and legally justified that a framework addressing only damage after 43 years fails to serve the affected individuals. The chamber was silent for a long time after that. Then Gressover produced a low seismic pulse that the translation system rendered simply as yes. And Vessa's skin patterns shifted to something her liaison translated as agreement. 28 species, one by one, expressed their agreement across the chamber through patterns, pulses, compressions, tonal harmonics, electrical fields, and every other form of language present in that room. Word traveled fast in the galaxy, which was remarkable considering how large it was. But diplomacy created its own information networks, tightly woven, attentive, the kind of communication structure that had evolved precisely because the people who needed the information most were also the people most likely to be somewhere that official channels didn't reach. Within a week of Vethra's announcement, the word was out. Not the technical details. This does not include the composite signature system, the retroactive commission, or the specific legal amendments. The word that traveled was simpler and more intriguing. The human delegate had silenced the Grand Deliberation. Not through argument. The delegate did not use threats or political pressure to silence the Grand Deliberation. Through a precise act of linguistic knowledge, through the application of a language that most species treated as unapproachable, performed at a level that the Velthri themselves acknowledged as genuine. Instead of using that act to advance human interests, the human delegate had used it to name a problem that affected every species except, arguably, the Velthri. Had asked for nothing in return. Had simply put the problem in the room, in a language the room could hear. This operation was, in the reporting that reached Earth's diplomatic corps, described as an extraordinary tactical success. Mara, when she read the reports, thought they were missing the point. Though she was not entirely sure what the right point was, she let it go. Curtis, in the evenings when the framework work slowed enough to allow it, was keeping a personal log. Not an official record. The official records were being maintained by the Veltri documentation infrastructure with meticulous care. A personal one. Notes on what he'd observed, what he'd learned, and what he thought was true about the situation that might not show up in any official document. He wrote, on the 21st day, Mara thinks the gap isn't language. She's right, and she's also wrong. The gap is language, and everything the language contains, the history of who built it and why, the assumptions that got baked into the structure, the things it was designed to carry, and the things it wasn't. Learning a language isn't just learning the words. It's learning the weight. Mara learned the weight. Most people don't bother because they assume the weight belongs to someone else. I've been thinking about what Morning said about the Doe losing their legal existence for 23 years. 23 years of not being counted. Not because they weren't there or didn't do what was asked, but because their agreement was in an expired format. A format that expired. I keep coming back to that. The idea that your existence can be provisional. Your presence can be filed as non-binding. I think the thing Mara did, the thing she's been doing since before we got here, was refuse to let that stand. Not because it affected humans. Humanity lost nothing in the previous deliberations that I can find. We were barely represented. We barely showed up. She did it because she understood the cost to others, had the tools to speak up, and believed that speaking up was the right use of those tools. I'm going to think about that for a long time. On the 32nd day of the suspension, Vethra asked to meet with Mara privately. They met in a small room off the main administrative corridor, not the deliberation chamber, not the grand architecture of formal speech, just a room with flat walls and 2 seats and the ambient hum of the station systems. Vethra said, without preamble, in Velthric, but in the informal register, the one between equals, I want to ask you something that is not a formal question. Mara said, ask. Why did you learn our language?
They paused. Not how.
I understand the how.
Why?
Mara thought about it. Because, she said, I kept finding that the places where understanding broke down were the places where the gap between languages was treated as permanent. As if the gap were a fact of nature rather than a consequence of choice. She paused. I don't like consequences that are treated as facts of nature. Vethra was quiet for a moment. You are the first non-Veltri speaker I have heard use the formal witness register correctly, they said. Not approximately. Correctly. It took 9 years, Mara said. Most people would not spend 9 years on something this difficult, for a result that is uncertain. Most people wouldn't, Mara said. But I was always going to end up in a room that needed it. I just didn't know which room. Vethra looked at her in the way she had come to recognize, the particular attention of someone who is genuinely listening. Your species, they said, is very new to us. You have been represented in the deliberation framework for only 2 sessions. We did not expect. They paused, and the pause had a quality that Mara recognized as Velthri's discomfort with incomplete thought, a rare thing. We made assumptions about what your species could offer. Those assumptions were incomplete. Assumptions usually are, Mara said. Yes, Vethra said. They usually are. There was a moment on the 38th day that Mara would return to for the rest of her life. It was late in the evening, and the framework technical work had reached the point where the prototype composite signature system was being tested in a live demonstration, a simulated agreement being made between 3 species simultaneously, the Keth, Suolvi, and Doe, recorded by the new system in real time. The 3 delegations stood, or settled, or hovered, in the test chamber. The system ran. The agreement was made in 3 simultaneous languages, and the recording system produced its composite signature, an artifact that contained, simultaneously, seismic pulse, skin pattern sequence, and atmospheric compression, woven together by the software into something that could be stored, retrieved, and verified. The technical team played it back. What came out of the speakers was not exactly any of the 3 languages. It was something that had all 3 in it, that resolved differently depending on what instrument you used to listen, but that was coherent as a whole, that held together. Grassover, listening, produced a low seismic pulse that the interface rendered as that is what we said. Vess said, that is exactly what we said. Morning said, it sounds the way it felt to make the agreement. Mara stood at the edge of the test chamber and listened to the playback and felt something she couldn't name exactly, something that had to do with the distance between the apartment with the plumbing pipe resonance model and this room, on a station in neutral space, hearing three species languages played back in a weave that belonged to all of them. Curtis appeared beside her and said, quietly, "That's it, isn't it?"
"Yeah," she said.
"That's the thing that works."
"Yeah."
He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're not going to make a big deal about this, are you?" "No," she said. "Didn't think so." He paused. "For the record, I think you should."
"Noted," she said.
He smiled. "I'll make a note in my log." The framework was ratified on the 44th day. Not rushed. Not forced. It took 44 days because the work took 44 days, because 29 species had to understand and agree to something new, and understanding and agreeing genuinely, across 29 different ways of understanding and agreeing, was not a thing that could be accelerated beyond a certain point without breaking. But it happened. The composite signature system was accepted into the Velthary legal framework as a binding evidence standard. The Retroactive Review Commission was formally established, with 8 founding member species, including humanity and the DOE, and with a mandate that was, in the words of the final ratification document, to ensure that no agreement made in this framework shall be treated as provisional without the explicit, informed understanding of all parties. The deliberation reconvened. It ran for 11 more days, not 14, as originally scheduled, but 11, because the revised framework made certain things faster. The talking was careful and thorough. Because when everyone in the room trusted that what they were saying was being heard as they meant it, certain arguments resolved themselves. Certain disputes, relitigated for decades because the original resolution had been uncertain, closed cleanly. Grassover's 3 systems were not returned. They were genuinely disputed, and the Commission would handle them through the retroactive review process, which would take time. But the Keth delegation's current territorial claims were formally and completely ratified, at full legal weight, in the new composite signature format. Grassover's seismic pulse, when the ratification was confirmed, was, according to their liaison, the Keth equivalent of a shout. The Suolvi trade routes were ratified. The small species research access agreements were ratified. The DOE's civilizational recognition, their legal standing in the deliberation framework, was ratified formally, completely, and irreversibly. Morning's atmospheric response to that last ratification was something the translation interface struggled with. The closest it could get was, "This is what was always true," now made certain. Mara was in the chamber for all of it. She did not speak during the reconvened deliberation except when asked. Once, during the formal presentation of the composite system to the full chamber, when she provided a technical overview, and once during the closing ceremony, when she responded to Vethra's formal acknowledgement of the human delegation's contribution. In that response, she said, "The human delegation is grateful for the opportunity to contribute to a framework that belongs to everyone present. We did not build this framework. We named a problem and worked with the people most affected by it to find a solution. The framework is theirs. We are glad to be part of it." Vethra, in the formal register of permanent record, the highest register, the one that entered the permanent legal archives, said, "Let it be recorded that this deliberation was altered by an active witness. That the witness was performed by a human named Mara Osei, and that through this act, the galaxy's diplomatic architecture was fundamentally changed. Let this record be kept at full tonal weight, permanently." The chamber held the sound of it for a moment, all 7 frequencies at full legal weight, in the formal register of permanent record. Then the deliberation continued. Mara sat in the departure lounge of Cradle Point on the last morning and did not feel triumphant. She felt worn out. She felt the particular kind of hollow that came after an extended period of sustained, high-stakes concentration, the feeling of a vessel that had been completely full for a long time and was now, with the pressure released, aware of its own emptiness for the first time. She also felt something else. Quieter. Harder to name. Curtis sat beside her, his bag on his lap and a cup of tea in hand, embodying the practiced stillness of someone who had learned, over the last 2 months, when Mara needed someone to talk to and when she needed someone to simply be present. He was being present. The departure lounge had a view window, a long arc of transparent material looking out into the neutral space that Cradle Point occupied, the space that had no territorial claim and no strategic value except as a place where things that needed to happen between different kinds of minds could happen. Stars outside. The specific quality of deep space darkness, which was not the darkness of a room with no lights, but the darkness of vastness, a darkness that had substance to it, depth, the kind of dark that reminded you that what you could see was a very small fraction of what was there. Mara looked at it and thought about the frequency map. It was about how the chamber's walls had resonated in the early morning, about the sound of 3 species languages playing back in a weave. She thought about something Vethra had said to her in one of the late-night working sessions, an informal register, with a particular frankness that had developed between them over weeks of working together in close proximity. Vethra had said, "We built this framework to prevent the fracture from happening again." The fracture was caused by the divergence of our own dialects, our own people, speaking the same language, growing so far apart that the same words meant opposite things. We built the framework to prevent that. And in preventing it, we built something that assumed sameness, that treated everyone who entered it as a version of us who hadn't fully learned the language yet. Mara had said, and the fracture happened anyway. Not the way we expected, Vethra had said. It didn't divide us. It excluded everyone else. This is a different kind of fracture. Quieter. Harder to see. Because you were on the inside, Mara had said. Because we were on the inside, Vethra had agreed. Mara had thought about that conversation many times since. She was thinking about it now, looking at the deep space dark, and she was thinking about what it meant to be on the inside of something. About the languages she spoke, and the ones she didn't. About the framework she moved through every day that had been built by someone else, for someone else's purposes, and which she had learned to navigate without ever fully questioning whether the navigation was the right problem to solve. SYMJHY, she thought, the phrase that had come to her from somewhere in the long, difficult weeks, that meant something like, and from this moment, in a translation she'd assembled from pieces, not a translation she'd found in a reference. A phrase that felt true in a way that suggested it was the right phrase even if the derivation was imprecise. SYMJHY, everything is different because of what happened here. Not loudly different. Not in the way of revolutions and proclamations. In the way of foundations, the way the ground under a building could shift by centimeters and the building above could hold for years, hold its shape and its appearance, while the shift propagated upward, slowly, through every level, until the day when something that had been stressed for years finally, quietly, settled into a new alignment. The framework they had built would do that. It would take decades. The retroactive commission would work through 312 agreements over years. New agreements would be made in the composite system. Slowly, the architecture of how the galaxy talked to itself would change. Not because humans were superior. Not because Mara Osei had solved a problem that no one else could. Because someone had cared enough to learn the weight of a language that wasn't hers and had used it precisely, at the right moment, in service of people who had been waiting a very long time for someone to say clearly what everyone already knew. The departure call came. Mara stood and picked up her bag. Morning was there. She hadn't seen them come in, but they were there, a column of organized presence near the window. The interface on her wrist produced the translation. Morning said, "I will think of you when I next stand in an empty room and listen to what it says." Mara said, "I'll think of you whenever I'm in a room that needs a witness." Morning said, "The galaxy is full of those." "I know," Mara said. She walked toward the departure gate. Curtis fell in beside her. Bag on his shoulder, tea finished, tablet under his arm. He said, "You know the Corps is going to give you a commendation." "Probably," she said. "And a title. The title should have the word senior in it." "Very likely. And a bigger office. I'll use it to store plumbing pipe." Curtis laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised him. Then he was quiet for a moment, walking. Then he said, "Mara, for what it's worth, and I know you're going to tell me not to make a big deal of it, I think what you did here is going to matter for a very long time. And I think I was really lucky to be here for it." Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Caro, Curtis. Caro, right now, in this moment, that means something." He didn't ask her to explain. He just nodded. They walked through the gate together. 6 months later, Mara was back in her apartment. Not the same apartment. She'd moved to a smaller one near the university where she'd accepted a joint appointment between the Xenolinguistics department and the newly established Multi-Species Communication Institute, which had been funded in the aftermath of Cradle Point by a coalition of governments that had read the reports and understood, finally, what they were looking at. The apartment was smaller but had better acoustics. She had thought about that before signing the lease. The walls were a specific density of concrete that resonated in a frequency range she liked. The windows faced east, and the morning light came in without interference. She had not brought the plumbing pipe model. That had been disassembled when she moved. She was working on something more sophisticated now, a proper acoustic modeling rig with instruments designed not just to demonstrate resonance, but to detect the very fine-grained frequency differences between communicative modes. A tool for the framework. She was working on the composite signature project. In the evenings, she was also writing. It was not a technical paper, although such papers existed and were being reviewed, cited, and debated in the journals she cared about. She was writing something different. Longer, more patient, an account of the Grand Deliberation and the years of work that had preceded it, not as a triumph narrative, not as a human achievement story, but as a study of the gap. Of what it looked like to stand at the edge of a gap that everyone had decided was permanent, and to ask whether permanence was actually a fact of the gap or just a fact of how long people had been refusing to cross it. She worked on it slowly. There was no urgency. The Framework Commission was working, steadily and carefully, through the retroactive agreements. The deliberation architecture was being updated. A training program for composite system documentation was being rolled out to 6 species diplomatic services simultaneously, with Morning formally appointed as the DOE representative to the Standing Commission, providing the atmospheric compression component. Curtis was the Earth liaison to the Commission. He had asked for the appointment and received it without difficulty, partly because he was extremely good at the job and partly because the Commission had specifically asked for him by designation in their founding documents, which had been a surprise to the Earth Diplomatic Corps and not at all a surprise to Mara. He sent her messages regularly. They were detailed and organized, and each one contained a brief personal observation at the end that had nothing to do with the diplomatic content. Some of them were excellent. One evening, she received a message from Vethra. The message was in Velthric, written Velthric, the formal register of formal correspondence. It was brief. It said, "The Review Commission has completed its first retroactive case. The Keth Territorial Dispute, 3 systems. The original agreement has been reconstituted in composite format and formally ratified. The Keth delegation has been informed. The legal record has been updated." And then below the formal content, in the informal register, the register between equals, the register they had used in late-night sessions, Grassover sent a seismic acknowledgement through the station's structural sensors. It was very loud. "We are still detecting aftershocks. I believe the letter constitutes a positive response." Mara read it twice and smiled. She wrote back, "Please tell Grassover that the human delegation received the message." She closed the message and sat for a moment in her apartment, in the excellent acoustics, in the morning light. Somewhere in deep space, the retroactive commission was working. Morning was in a room that had been specially updated with equipment to capture DOE compression language, allowing it to be recorded as important evidence for the first time in 4,000 years. 29 species were, slowly, learning what their voices sounded like when they were actually being heard. Grassover's seismic pulse was still reverberating somewhere in the structural sensors of a neutral space station built in the shape of an ear. The galaxy was full of rooms that needed witnesses. Mara picked up her pen and started writing. "Caro, this is the moment. Of SYMJHY, and from this moment, everything is different. Not because of what was said, because of what was finally precisely heard." The end.